What would you think if your cloud provider shut you out of your data at the request of the government? Recently, a company found out how that feels. Let's talk about it. Welcome to the Cloud Computing Insider. This channel explores the ins and outs of cloud computing without an agenda or following to the narrative set by big tech marketing. We look at what works, what does not, and the actual value of this technology in a balanced and information-forward way. If that interests you, please subscribe, like, and comment. I'm your host, David Linthicum, author, speaker, cloud and AI architect, top 10 cloud and AI influencer, B-list geek, and over-the-hill mountain biker. Let's get started. So this is interesting. Public cloud giants like Microsoft have begun enforcing government laws and policies directly, going far beyond their traditional role as a neutral technology platform. This shift is making enterprises worldwide question whether they can truly trust their chosen cloud providers. And so what's happening out there, we're starting to see stories where companies are restricted access, governments are restricted access, typically through the hyperscalers, the big ones, Google, Microsoft, and AWS, because of a request that comes down for the government. Whether it's European government, American government, it doesn't matter. And so this is kind of chilling the world of cloud computing, especially companies that have been in the cloud for a long period of time, trust them, and are concerned now that they're going to be shut out of their data. So in a recent Register article, which I'm going to put in the description, according to the article, Microsoft disconnected Indian companies Nayara, hopefully I pronounced that right, energy from its cloud resources last week before restoring access ahead of a court clash. So you can read the full story in the article. I urge you to do so. This is not a news channel, and so we're not going to go that deeply into it here. But the story starts on July 18th when the European Union approved a fresh set of sanctions aimed at making it harder for Russia to continue its war against Ukraine. Deep in the fine print of the sanctions order is a mention of an oil refinery operated by Nayara Energy in an Indian city, which the EU says is 49% owned by Russian state oil company called Rosneft. So I'm not going to get into the details of the news story here. Evidently, this is geopolitical stuff. In other words, European Union, putting sanctions against companies that are working with Russia, around the conflict and the war in Ukraine. And I'm not a technical person, definitely, don't have an opinion of all that stuff. But what's interesting is that this basically resulted in them shutting off the cloud technology to this energy company. So in other words, Microsoft was compelled by the government some way to go ahead and shut them down and disallow access to their information, their applications, all those sorts of things. And many of these companies out there, they're tightly coupled to the cloud providers they've been working with for many years. So they were totally disabled. So they had to take them to court to get access back to the cloud providers. And obviously it took time to do that. And they were damaged as they went through it. Whether it was good or bad, I'm not going to comment on that. It's just the politics of it. It's just the fact of the matter is they could do it. In other words, and companies are becoming a bit more paranoid about this, certainly in the European Union, in some of the non-US companies that I work with, in that their big concern is that US-based law enforcement is somehow going to be able to reach into a US-based cloud provider and look at their data, shut them down from accessing the data, or harm them in other ways. And so they're asking the question, should I trust these US-based cloud providers? And I think after, this incident occurred, this energy company would say no. So just a few more details. On July 2025, Microsoft suspended access to Teams and Outlook for the energy company, again, a major Indian oil company, in response to new European Union sanctions targeting Russian interests. As we mentioned before, this rapid shutdown, despite the energy company being an Indian enterprise, highlighted the vulnerability of companies reliant on foreign cloud vendors. So this is kind of a company that got caught in the middle. So in other words, there were sanctions against Russia. They were somehow thought to, or maybe even doing business with Russia in providing energy. And so the European Union put pressure on Microsoft to shut them down. And again, it's not the fact the politics behind it. Whether you're right or left, it doesn't really matter. It's the fact of the matter is that they were able, just because of geopolitics, in this case a war, able to react to sanctions by shutting somebody down from accessing their data and the cloud technology that they were already using, probably for many years. Now, we've had aspects of this happening for the last 10 years. I've heard of organizations that were targeted as criminal organizations that had their cloud assets shut down and disallowed, things like that, subpoenas that go after the cloud assets. And now we're getting in the geopolitics of it, where the foreign companies are rightfully concerned that they're going to be depending on a big hyperscaler. The hyperscaler is going to be asked to enforce some law, regulation, whatever, sanction in this case, and it's going to shut them down from accessing their data, which is the crown jewels of the company. And as you guys know, if you do that for more than a couple, 3 days, that's going to put you out of business. And so the companies are kind of hitting the panic button now in terms of, is there too much risk in using a US-based cloud provider? And I can't blame them. So the energy company took Microsoft to court in India to restore its cloud services, ultimately winning reinstatement within 2 days. So they lost 2 days of productivity, but the damage was already done. The energy company quickly switched to a local Indian provider, showing how swiftly trust can be lost and business can be moved away. So they reacted as I would expect them to react. And many organizations are going to bring information and bring their data that's on the public cloud providers that they're leveraging, in this case, Microsoft, back to on-prem systems, or in many cases, they're just going to pick a sovereign cloud provider. So they found a cloud provider that serves only India. Obviously, they viewed that as a much safer bet as to not pull what Microsoft did on them. And so they went ahead and switched there. And I think a lot of organizations are going to do that proactively now. They're going to see things like this and you really kind of hit the panic button in the fact that there's a lack of trust there if they do have the capability of doing it, even if it would never happen to you or never happen to your company. And that's probably going to be the case. So the odds are still pretty slim that they're going to pull this on other companies. But the reality is, and the companies will tell you this, that they're subject to federal laws in the companies where they reside. And so if the government puts pressure on them, they're going to respond accordingly based on their own, self-interest. And so it may be a better bet to leverage equipment you own, private clouds, things like that, or leverage a sovereign cloud provider. And I think that's the point being made now. So, Microsoft would say their actions were compelled by international law, but enterprises see this as a dangerous overreach by a vendor acting under foreign government pressure. And this is blurring the lines between compliance and enforcement, which raises tough ethical questions about who controls critical business data and infrastructure. Obviously, they're told when they sign up with a cloud provider that you control it. In other words, we're a trusted intermediary. Put your data on our stuff. We're going to run it for you on your behalf. We're going to implement any security measures that you need, including physical security. But what they're typically not going to tell you, and this may be in the fine print, that if the government puts pressure on you, whether it's US-based government, EU, UK, things like that, they're going to respond accordingly. So if companies are working within these countries, they're beholden to the laws and regulations of the countries. And so they're going to say if they're asked to do something or compelled to do something, they're going to go ahead and do it. And so I'm not really blaming Microsoft here as much. In other words, they're just responding with their own self-interest. But it is bringing up a critical decision I think that many of these companies need to make. If Microsoft and other hyperscalers can reach out and disallow them access to the core processes and data that they need to run their business, even taking their business out of business in many cases, that may be a risk that they can't tolerate. So companies now realize that relying on public cloud providers, hyperscalers, exposes them to sudden service disruption, and not because of technical failures, but because of geopolitics, are shifting government mandates. In other words, your politics is affecting you. This awareness is causing a surge of risk assessments, especially among firms outside the US and its allies. So again, what this is driving a question I think many of the companies had over the years. And I got this early on when people were moving into the cloud. What if the geopolitical environment changes? And in other words, and there's some reason why we can't use an American-based cloud provider, and we can't use a cloud provider that's going to be subject to the laws of particular countries, because that may affect us through unintended consequences, which I guess is what happened here. That may be something that I would advise them to not take the risk in doing, because you got to remember the sovereign cloud providers and using private cloud offerings are typically not only safer options in terms of running afoul of regulation like this, but they're cheaper. So there's no reason not to look at these options. So in many instances, this could be a blessing in disguise where, the energy company moving its stuff over to a sovereign cloud, Indian-based sovereign cloud, may not only find the risk is gone in terms of other governments, causing outages for them, which are politically motivated, and ultimately being able to pay less money as well. So it's win-win. So in response, I think the enterprises are increasingly seeking sovereign and private clouds as an option that guarantee data stays under local control and cannot be seized or interrupted by foreign laws. That's the big thing here. Hybrid approaches also allow businesses to combine innovation with security, using public cloud for non-critical operations and private environments for sensitive data. And that's always going to be an option. I think many organizations may do that if they can't find an analog for things that they have running in the cloud, office automation, AI-based systems, things like that. Obviously the big hyperscalers have very innovative and very attractive environments that you're looking to leverage, and innovation may be occurring on those cloud providers. However, if many of these assets that are up on the cloud providers are truly going to be a risk to the business if they're taken away from the business, then I think it's okay to have a hybrid-based approach. And typically a hybrid-based approach should always be considered, where you have, certain assets are running on a sovereign cloud, maybe some that are running on it. This is a multi-cloud approach on a public cloud provider, or you're running your own stuff on your own equipment and your own data center, a co-location provider, a managed service provider, and you're leveraging the public cloud providers only when you absolutely need them. In other words, it's going to lower your risk if you're not putting a lot of operational data on those cloud providers. If they do shut you out, it's not going to kill you. So the old model, trusting public clouds for reliability and neutrality, has been shattered with stuff like this. And we've seen stuff like this before by cases like Microsoft and Nayara. Today's enterprises are proactively diversifying their cloud strategies, prioritizing autonomy, legal certainty, and uninterrupted access above all else to their information and their data and their core processes. So the priority is going to be key. It's going to be, if there's any geopolitical risks of me getting shut out of my cloud provider, they're not going to use that cloud provider. And so many of these questions weren't asked 10, 15 years ago when people first started moving into cloud. Certainly not by me as much. Maybe I should have been a little bit more adamant about it. And definitely not by my clients who are moving their assets in the cloud, but maybe it should be asked. And this should be a core risk assessment. And not only looking at the BCDR stuff and the outages and reliability and things like that, which are also important, but the fact of the matter is, just because of geopolitical stuff beyond your control, you may get kicked out of your cloud. And they may put you out of business if you don't have the time to react and respond and get your assets on some other platform. And that's the core message here. Well, don't forget to like and subscribe and check out my other videos on this channel. Also check out my InfoWorld Cloud Computing blog, my 100+ LinkedIn learning courses, and of course, my generative AI architecture course out on GoCloudCareers. And finally, my latest book, An Insider's Guide to Cloud Computing. So until next week, you guys stay very, very safe. Later.